New America would like to welcome you to our virtual event. The program will begin momentarily. While we are waiting, I want to review a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and a recording will be posted to the New America events page within 48 hours after the event. Attendees will be in listen-only mode, and you will not be able to be seen or heard by your fellow attendees or panelists. Therefore, we encourage you to share your comments and questions in the Slido box located to the right of the video. Closed captioning is available by hovering over the video and clicking CC at the bottom of the video. If you encounter any issues during the event, please contact events@newamerica.org. Thank you for joining us. We will begin momentarily.
Hello, and welcome to our panel event on Varying Degrees 2023. My name is Rachel Fishman, and I am the director for the higher education program at New America, where our vision is a higher education system that is accessible, affordable, equitable, and accountable for helping students lead fulfilling and economically secure lives. There have been a lot of headlines lately from Paul Tufts' New York Times Magazine article that the title was Americans Are Losing Faith in Higher Education, to a Gallup poll that has been widely cited that shows a very steep decline in American confidence in higher education, where almost a decade ago, 3 out of 4 Americans had confidence in higher education, and now that stands at just 41%. So we're here today to dig a little bit deeper. Do Americans think higher education is still worth it? For the past 7 years, New America has been asking Americans these critical questions regarding their perspectives on the value of education after high school. Our signature annual survey, Varying Degrees, is released every summer, and it continues to gauge Americans' opinions on issues regarding the value of educational opportunities after high school, how those opportunities are funded, and how we can hold institutions accountable for that funding. This year, we also had a great section about diversity and equity in higher education, so I encourage you to take a look at varyingdegrees.org. These findings together shed light on what the public's priorities are for education after high school and how the nation's higher education system can be revamped to meet our nation's needs. We're excited to share some of our top findings from this year's report and then dig a little deeper with our panel to unpack the nuances of how Americans feel about the value of education after high school and why it matters for policymaking. I have a couple of thank yous I want to make before we get started. So first, a huge thank you to my colleague and co-author, Sophie Nguyen, who is unable to join us for this event as it was beautifully timed with a long-awaited vacation and long-planned vacation. Sophie is really one of the big brains behind this whole Varying Degrees operation, and she's just very thoughtful with every administration of this survey. So if you ever have any questions about anything, please feel free to reach out to her. And myself and my colleague Olivia, who are also co-authors on this work, are happy to field questions as well. I also wanted to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who has generously supported this work since its inception 7 years ago. And yes, there is going to be a Varying Degrees 2024, so stay tuned for that next summer. And lastly, if you're following along on social media, please use the hashtag Varying Degrees. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Olivia Checki, to present some of our findings from this year's report. Take it away, Olivia.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everyone. My name is Olivia Checki. I am the Program Associate for the Higher Education team here at New America, as well as one of the co-authors of this year's Varying Degrees report. And I'm so excited to be highlighting some of our key takeaways from this year's survey. Varying Degrees is our annual survey funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that highlights Americans' perspectives on education after high school. This survey focuses on issues related to value, funding, and accountability, and has been conducted annually since 2017. This means that Varying Degrees provides us a longitudinal analysis of Americans' opinions on these issues. These data not only reflect such opinions at a particular time, but also over a period of time. The survey is administered by NORC at the University of Chicago and samples 1,497 American adults. We oversample Black, Latinx, and Asian Americans, as well as student loan borrowers, and we collected data in March through May of this year. For the purpose of this analysis, we define higher education as any education after high school that includes any formal education and/or training. So this is going to include apprenticeships, technical education, vocational education, and coursework that applies to associates, bachelor's, or advanced degrees. And now for the highlights. For our purposes today, we will focus on Americans' perspectives going back to 2017. When considering questions of value, we find that Americans do acknowledge the benefit that higher education brings to individuals and society. Just 28% believe that their immediate or close family members can achieve financial security with only a high school diploma. The rest would say that their family members need some sort of higher education to achieve such financial security, whether that be a technical certificate, associate's, bachelor's, or advanced degree. We find that both Democrats and Republicans believe that their relatives would need some sort of higher education to achieve financial security. 35% of Democrats and 29% of Republicans would specifically say that a bachelor's degree is the minimum level of education that they believe their close family members need. However, while most Americans would agree that there is a value in obtaining a higher education, they also do not believe that higher education is currently fine as it is. We have been asking this question since 2017 and continue to find that a minority of Americans agree that higher education in this country is fine as is. And when we break this down by political affiliation, we find that this holds true for both Democrats and Republicans. Ultimately, this indicates that Americans want to see some sort of change to the system. For years now, we have also asked a question of whether Americans believe that someone can get a high-quality education after high school that is also affordable. We consistently find that Americans are split on this issue. This year, just 53% of Americans agree that this is possible, and this number has hovered around the 50% mark since we began posing this question. Republicans are a bit more likely than Democrats to agree that Americans can get a high-quality, affordable higher education. We also pose a question over who should be primarily responsible for funding higher education: the government because it is good for society, or individuals because they personally benefit. We find that 3 in 5 Americans believe that the government should fund higher education, and that this has not changed too much since we began asking this question 5 years ago. However, it is also worth noting that there is a stark partisan difference when this question is asked. Over 3/4 of Democrats believe that the government should be primarily responsible for funding higher education, compared with just 36% of Republicans. Conversely, about 2/3 of Republicans believe that individuals should be funding higher education because they personally benefit. This partisan divide has remained consistent throughout the years this question has been raised since 2018. Ultimately, we find that a vast majority, approximately 8 in 10 Americans, believe that the state and federal governments should invest more in higher education. While Democrats are more likely to agree with this than Republicans, we still find support from approximately 2/3 of Republicans on this matter. This has also remained pretty consistent over the years. When shifting to matters of accountability, we find that Americans are broadly supportive of the Biden administration's new gainful employment regulation. There are 2 parts to this. The first considers if career education programs should lose eligibility for federal financial aid if they consistently fail to help graduates earn more than those with just a high school diploma. The second part considers if these programs should lose eligibility for federal financial aid if they consistently leave students deeply in debt in comparison to their earnings. When we raise both questions, we find that approximately 8 in 10 Americans are supportive of these components, even when broken down by political affiliation. We expand on this with a question over whether colleges and universities should lose some access to taxpayer dollars if they yield poor outcomes. This may be seen through low graduation rates, low rates of graduates earning a living wage, high rates of graduates earning less than the average high school graduate, high student loan debt relative to earnings, low rates of graduates paying down their student loans, and high default rates for student loan repayments. Across the board and over the years, we find that the majority of Americans are generally supportive of the idea that colleges and universities should lose some access to taxpayer dollars if they produce these poor outcomes. For example, we see that around 3 in 4 Americans believe that institutions should lose some access to taxpayer dollars if they yield low graduation rates. And around 2 in 3 Americans believe that institutions should lose some access to taxpayer dollars if they have low rates of graduates paying down their student loans. These are just a few of the findings from this year's Varying Degrees survey, and there are so many more in our full length report. If you're interested in learning more, feel free to check out all of our data at varyingdegrees.org. Thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to Rachel.
Thanks, Olivia. And yeah, I want to put a plug in for varyingdegrees.org because we have a cool data tool that we have every year where you can actually look at all of the questions we ask, and we only report on the tip of the iceberg of questions. The data set is very rich. And our data tool enables you to put together custom data visualizations based on all the demographics that we've been collecting over the years. So you should take a look just for that, because there might be some data viz that you can pull that will be useful for your research needs. So we're going to get started with our panel. So let's dig in as I introduce our panelists. So you will probably see that, unfortunately, Dr. Noah Dresner is not going to be able to join us today. We sent him our well wishes, and if you haven't had the opportunity to engage with Dr. Dresner's work, you should take a moment to do so. It's really great. It delves into understanding the public's perception of higher education, both as a public good and as a private good, and how we should understand its value, not just as an individual good, but as a good for society, a question that, as Olivia pointed out, we ask on our own survey. These are critical topics that we're going to touch upon today with our other two panelists, and it's thanks to colleagues like Dr. Dresner that we know that even though we're seeing a lot of reporting about this pessimism and negativity about how people feel about higher education, there is evidence that communities do indeed value when their citizens get education after high school. And so with us to discuss more today are Kelly Leone and David Schleifer. So I'm going to introduce both of them. Kelly is the Vice President of Communications and Government Affairs at the Institute for Higher Education Policy, or IHEP. She leads the organization's efforts to amplify evidence and research-based policy solutions that expand college access and success for students who have been historically underrepresented in post-secondary settings. Before joining IHEP in February, she served in several communication roles at the U.S. Department of Education, including press secretary. And David is the Director of Research at Public Agenda, a national research to action organization that digs deep into the key challenges facing our democracy. He leads qualitative and survey research on people's opinions about experiences with education, healthcare, and democracy. So welcome to both of you. I'm so glad you could join me. And so I'm going to kick it off to Kelly first with a question. So a lot has been reported in the past couple of months about how Americans are losing confidence in higher education. I mentioned that at the top with my opening remarks. People are questioning whether it's really worth it. Beyond our own varying degrees data, which Olivia presented, which shows sort of mixed opinions about higher education, we see numbers like in the Wall Street Journal, which reported that only 2 in 5 Americans think a 4-year degree is worth the cost. What do you say to the skeptics out there? Is higher education worth it? And how do we quantify and communicate what post-secondary education means for students?
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for the question, and thanks to you and the New America team for convening this conversation, and Olivia for that presentation. Such a critical question, such a critical issue right now, with headline after headline pushing back on this notion. I think I'll begin first by saying that the dividends and return on investment for a post-secondary education is lifelong in nature. And to push back slightly on the Paul Tough article that was in the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago, I really appreciated an alternative perspective that was raised by David Deming, who is a professor out of Harvard, who wrote in The Atlantic just last week an article that I thought was fabulous, titled "The College Backlash has gone too far." And he pointed out a really helpful, perhaps oversight, maybe shortcoming of the analysis cited in that New York Times piece, which came from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, which didn't quite delve into the reality that the wage premium for a college graduate grows over one's lifetime. It's not the same. And that analysis rested on the belief that what the premium is shortly after graduation or shortly after college remains the same. And that's not the case. The wage premium for a college graduate grows over one's lifetime. So I offer that as an alternative analysis and understanding of that notion of there is a benefit that is lifelong in nature. I began by saying that the dividends are lifelong in nature. With that, I'd like to highlight some analysis that IHEP has done in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that really delves into quantifying and communicating post-secondary value. And it's not so much about if a post-secondary education is worth it, because I think we know that it is. The research is telling us that it is. College graduates earn upwards of $1 million more over their lifetime than their counterparts who do not hold those degrees. It's more of what is a post-secondary education worth? And along with that, how do we best communicate what that value is to prospective students and their families, to the tax-paying public, to policymakers who are making critical decisions about where to invest finite taxpayer resources. So it's a question of not if it is, it's what it's worth and how to convey that value. IHEP, in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, convened in 2019 the Post-Secondary Value Commission that really sought to delve into defining what post-secondary value is, ensuring that all students are able to receive value equitably, then measuring that value, and then seeking to put together an agenda to help policymakers put into practice ways to ensure that all students experience that value. So I can get into a little bit more about that, and I know we will in this discussion, but I just want to reframe the notion around, what is it worth? Is it worth it? No, it's what is a post-secondary education worth, and how are we best communicating that value to the public, to prospective students, to policymakers?
Yeah, I look forward to getting more into that. And I know even with our research, as Olivia had to point out, that we constantly point people in the direction of what we mean, even when we talk about post-secondary education, because often that was one of the things overlooked by the Paul Tough article, right? It conflated different degree types as not being college. Like, I think maybe a plumber was mentioned, and like that doesn't need some sort of post-secondary credential, when I definitely don't want somebody working on my house that doesn't have some sort of license or post-secondary credential. So I think too quickly we think about bachelor's degrees and beyond, and we don't think of value in terms of the other degrees. So I look forward to continuing this thread. One of the more often, I think, overlooked things about the value of education is really what the value of a higher education means as a good to society versus just as an individual good. And so, David, your research at Public Agenda has explored both, right? It's explored both the individual benefits of higher education and how graduates feel what their education has conferred to them, and also the societal benefits of higher education, what their degree brings to a community. So can you talk a little bit about what you've learned from your work and the nuances of how we should value higher education in both of these regards?
Right. Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks so much for having me. I think, the first thing I would say is, just how much I agree with the way Kelly framed the conversation, which is that, I think there is a lot of concern and hand wringing, I think, about this kind of like, loss of confidence in higher education. And I think, there's also, we've seen enrollment declines that are, not evenly distributed demographically, but, so there is reason for concern. I think I think it's really easy to I think what I see a lot is a sort of misinterpretation of that as like, that Americans aren't interested in, don't believe in college for some reason, like they're anti-intellectual, or, they just don't get it, right? Like they just don't get how much the wage premium is gonna, benefit them and their lives and their families. And I think that in the data, the varying degrees data, the data that Public Agenda, survey data the Public Agenda has collected, I think what we see is people certainly do think that post-secondary education is valuable. And also alongside that, they think it's too expensive and it takes too long, which is like pretty straightforward. And I think actually a lot of, like that's a valid, rational concern that people are expressing. But so in terms of these kind of larger benefits, like I'd say it's that, like, we see the ways in which people understand the value of higher education as we ask about that value in different economic realms. It's a little different when we talk about the kind of civic value of education. So we saw really strong majorities of Americans who think that working adults can benefit from getting a college degree. Sort of a slightly less, but still a strong majority of people who think that people with, just a high school degree can benefit. But then we also asked about benefits to people's states. Like, do people think that if more people in their state had a college education, would that attract more employers? Would that, benefit people's ability to earn a living? And we again, like, we just see this strong understanding that, people's states really can benefit if more people have a college degree. So it's not even asking about them themselves, it's sort of asking these population-wide questions. I will say it seemed like people had, when we frame the questions at the national level, about the nation's economy, that's where we saw some differences where only half of Americans said that the nation's economy would be stronger if more people had a college education. And we saw like a 24 percentage point difference between Democrats and Republicans on that question. But it seems like, people may have just a better sense of like what their state needs. And like when we frame questions in terms of attracting employers to your state, people were like, I got it. When we framed it in terms of like the national economy in this kind of big picture way, that's where people, I think had a little more trouble picturing the benefit. And then just on the civic side of the equation, we asked about the sort of, whether people thought that higher education can help people become more informed and thoughtful participants in our democracy. And I would say that, we did see a good majority of people who think that, yes, that is the case, that there is this kind of civic benefit. There was about a 21 percentage point difference between Democrats and Republicans, but it's still a majority of Republicans who think that, that higher education has that benefit of helping people participate in our democracy. And we did focus groups in preparation for this survey, and people were pretty nuanced and in their understanding of kind of like the importance of having an education and being able to think critically, and how that can benefit people's ability to engage in our democracy. But I will say there are some, I think we have to be careful in how we communicate about that, because it can really easily, and we saw this in our focus groups, it can kind of really easily flip over into this sense of like, well, just because I don't have a college education, or wasn't able to get one, wasn't able to afford one, wasn't able to access one, doesn't mean that I don't vote, that I'm not smart, that I'm not, thoughtful. So I think people see the benefits in the civic realm, but I also think there's sort of a risk when we talk about those civic benefits of kind of making people who haven't had the opportunity to get that degree feel like they're being demeaned in some way.
It's interesting because we have had some similar findings when you talk about like local versus then broadening out regionally. We have this sense, and at least for a couple of years now, we have asked about how positive people feel about their local colleges versus like nationally. And people in general feel way more positively the smaller that like realm around you is, right? If it's more local, you tend to feel more positive. I think what's also interesting is you tend to feel more positive about community colleges. We ask about different sectors of education. I think, David, your research shows this as well. People really feel favorable towards community colleges because they have they're really community resources, right? They provide a lot of different types of degree types. They're low cost. They educate students direct from high school and adult students. So I think they're really seen as these important community resource centers, and they are well respected as that. And then like as things get more four-year or more private or more for-profit, we see sort of this drop off. So I thought that was very interesting that you brought some of this up, because we've seen the same in our data. And then we've also seen this for thee and not for me, where we ask a question about type of credential you would recommend your family member should get to achieve economic security in life, versus like what do you think the nation, like anybody out there, needs to achieve economic security. And there is like a big difference between those questions, and people think that their close family members just need more education than just a regular citizen out there. So I always think it's important in terms of understanding framing. People generally, I think, feel good about things locally and about their family. But when you start broadening out nationwide, I think it gets a little bit more challenging, which actually brings me really nicely into my next question, which is for either of you or both of you. Even though it sounds like, from what we know about the value of a degree and the public opinion research that David highlighted, that things perhaps are not as dire as they're made out to be in these headlines, that if you start focusing more on on degrees that are beyond the four-year degree, if you start focusing more on community colleges, on local institutions, people feel more positive. It does remain to be seen that we have seen in varying degrees, despite like some positive news, this overall pessimism that's simmering in the background. So how do we interpret these findings in the context of current national events? And I'm going to like zero in on higher ed events, because there's a lot going on in the atmosphere, and people are feeling, I think, negative generally. So like leaving that partially aside, what do you think, given the context of like what's going on with student debt cancellation, the attack of race and diversity on campus, rising costs, how do you think that perhaps influences public opinion, and what impact could that have on framing the value of higher education for those doubters out there moving forward?
happy to begin and welcome David's perspectives as well. You know, part of, I think, a fundamental reality about investments in post-secondary education versus other policy investments is immediacy, and thinking about, you know, what community members experience right now in the near term, and what, you know, the longer term and more ripple effect downstream benefits of this kind of public investment is. And some of the things that you cited, Rachel, around you know, what's happening in the higher education sphere right now, there is an element of immediacy, and wherever you fall on any one of those issues, for or against, agree versus disagree, it's immediate. It's in your face. You see, you know, lots of, you know, chest beating and sign raising and rallying around these issues, and that's present. But these downstream effects, these longer term effects around public health benefits, around increased civic engagement, around economic vitality, around workforce preparation, you know, increased public revenue and GDP locally and broad, like those are things that are all consequential benefits when more people have post-secondary credentials. And you talked about the for thee, not me. And that's where IHEP is really squarely focused on this issue, is this notion of equity. It is not enough for, you know, the loudest voices to push for a policy that is most beneficial to one particular constituency. No, we're concerned about these outcomes being accessible equitably, in an equitable manner to all individuals, because we know that when as many people as possible are able to reap these benefits, like those things that I mentioned increase, everyone's public health increases, the economic vitality of communities increases, and those in turn have longer term benefits for things like local tax bases, reliance on public benefits, higher versus lower. Those are things that are not as immediate as some of these headlines that are in your face now. And being a, you know, communications professional, I wish I had the formula to correct for that. I can only diagnose perhaps a challenge, and maybe together in dialogue and digging through some of these findings together, we can think through what those solutions might be.
Yeah, I think, particularly when we talk about equity, in the research that we did last year, which I should say was supported, but like varying degrees supported by the Gates Foundation and also by Lumina Foundation. So in that research, we asked about a number of policy and practice changes that could that states could invest in, and we frame this in terms of state investment to improve college access, affordability, and degree completion for Black and Latino students. And what we found is that majorities of Democrats, Republicans, Independents, majorities across racial ethnic identities support all of the investments that we asked about. Support was definitely stronger among Democrats and Independents than it was among Republicans. So Republican support for these initiatives tended to land at around like just over half to 2/3. Democratic support consistently stronger, but nonetheless, we're asking about very real policies public support for institutions that are especially effective at helping Black and Latino students complete their degrees, oversight of institutions that are not particularly helpful in helping Black and Latino students complete, effective advising, help with financial aid, we're asking about real things that could really make a difference for Black and Latino students, and the support is there. And on the other hand, I think what we did see is that when we asked about the kind of the bigger picture question of, whether people think that racism makes it more difficult for people of color to get a college degree. And there you see a big split. So only about a quarter of Republicans believe that to be the case, but about 3/4 of Democrats think that's the case, and half of independents think that racism makes it harder for people of color to get to get a post-secondary education. So I think, when we ask about these kind of in our research, we ask about these kind of big picture questions, right? Like, that's where we see people polarize. But when we ask about really practical things that could help Black and Latino students succeed, the support is there. I will say that support that we saw is even stronger when we frame those questions in terms of income instead of race. But it's a question of degree, right? Like the support is there either way. So I think there's kind of a sort of a de-escalation of the conversation that we can have when we focus on some like practical things that we know work, like effective advising and support for the institutions that are doing really great jobs with their Black and Latino students. So I feel like there are opportunities to make real progress, and the support is actually there, I think, to a degree that it feels like you may not realize if the only conversation seems to be about admissions at selective institutions, which we know is a fairly an important but also a fairly small piece of the overall higher ed picture.
This is a great lead into a question I had, David, your findings on equity and sort of racism and differences among different demographics, differences or similarities in opinion within demographic groups such as Democrats and Republicans, and race and ethnicity are expected and sometimes unexpected. Like, I think you discussed that there are sometimes Democrat-Republican divides, but the Republicans still believe in a majority, right? Like, it's not like the divide might be fairly large and significant, but the support is not insignificant among Republicans. Like, they're still in the majority, which is a good thing, all things considered. If you have Democrats in the 90s and Republicans in the 60s, the story isn't like, oh, Republicans hate whatever is going on. The story is there's a partisan divide, but both support, right? But then we definitely see some divides. Like Olivia showed, we have this stark divide where Republicans really view higher education as a individual good. And that makes a lot of their downstream answers very different than Democrats who believe it's a public good, right? And so that's going to change a lot of their downstream answers. So, what sort of differences and similarities within demographic groups that you both have been seeing do you find more very intriguing and that you think need further unpacking? And I don't know, David, if you want to start, since I think you conduct more of this research.
Sure. Yeah. Let me see. And I think there are a few. I mean, I think on that sort of like public good versus personal good, I would say, like there's sort of the personal responsibility factor kind of more generally. And I would say, like, we do, my colleagues and I do research in a number of different areas, right? Like higher ed, K-12 education, health and healthcare, democracy and civic engagement. And I think that, we often see this, it's not that Democrats don't value personal responsibility, but I think we often see in a lot of our research that there's a greater emphasis on personal responsibility among Republicans. And I think independents, which don't forget about them because they're like, 40% of the electorate, like they often kind of like sometimes they look like one side or the other. So I think we see that greater emphasis on personal responsibility when we talk about debt forgiveness, for example, the same way we see it in our healthcare research when we talk about health insurance. So I think that's a kind of like it's kind of part of how the kind of like bigger context of I think how people are thinking about some of these issues. I would also say, and I know this is not on the demographic point, but kind of on the question of public funding. I really like when we did the focus group research that we did to prepare for this survey. I really don't think people have a good understanding of two things that I think are really important. So one is just like what a public institution is. Like I think for people who work in higher ed policy, that's just such a basic thing, right? Like there's public, there's private, there's nonprofit, there's for-profit. Like we know we in this field think we know exactly what that means. Members of the public, that's just not how people think about institutions. And like, we were showing people charts of federal budgets and explaining like, there's your state flagship and, there's the regional comprehensives, and people could kind of get their heads around it, but it's just not how people think about the sector. And I think there's a real opportunity to help people understand, like, when there's less state funding for your state colleges and universities, like probably tuition's going to go up, like I think there's some things that there's some kind of connective tissue that we can help people make. And I think as part of that is this understanding of, I know that, we don't use the word trade school anymore or vocational school. Like, that's not a term that people tend to use in higher ed policy, but those are the terms that people use in everyday life. And if I had $1 for every time I was in a focus group and people said, oh, not so much college, but we really need people to get, learn how to be a plumber or an electrician. Like people don't understand that that's a thing that community colleges do, that's part of the post-secondary education picture. And I think like if we can help people make those connections, that like when we're talking about post-secondary education, we are talking about your plumber and your lab tech, et cetera. I think there's like helping people kind of connect those dots of like what higher education actually is would be really valuable, because I feel like people don't necessarily people aren't using the same terms that those of us in this kind of policy world are.
I'm compelled by many of the things you mentioned, David, also speaking as a person with a sister-in-law who's currently pursuing a trade at a local community college, where she is upskilling and investing in herself through post-secondary education locally. I too was struck by the sort of divergence between the understanding of, public good versus personal responsibility, yet the resounding shared belief that federal and state governments should invest in post-secondary education. Like everyone believes there should be an investment there. And to the points being made about, the state setting or even the local setting, while I haven't done the formal polling research in quite this way, I would bet that, people in my family could talk about the local colleges and local community colleges here and describe ways in which they are enhancing my local community. I happen to live in the Metro Detroit area, where Wayne State University, Henry Ford College are all very present in the local scene. And I would imagine that's the case for many people as well. They know how the local college, the local community college is enhancing either the lives of their own lives, the lives of their family members, the lives of members of their community, and strengthening the fabric of communities. But the larger that goes, the harder it is to make tangible. And perhaps one of the solutions that I was alluding to earlier is getting granular yet accessible and relatable about the ways that we're talking about the value of post-secondary investment. It's not this big, broad, abstract thing. It's the difference between this local community college being able to educate this many more individuals, or provide this community benefit, or offer this service to the people who live and work and are a part of this community. And I think that that is very much the case in pockets of communities around the country, and maybe something for policymakers to think about, being very, very granular and tangible and relatable when talking about why these investments matter. They matter to your neighborhood, they matter to your community, they matter to your local economy in these specific ways.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it goes back to a previous question I had about sort of what's being reported in the news, right? And a lot of what we consume is as time goes on, is more national in nature, right? As we've had like a dismantling of sort of local news outlets, or like a conglomeration or joining of them and purchasing of them, so that we have less, like more local news and more granular news and more national news. And we see headlines like there's a student debt crisis, but we don't really unpack what that means. And so it lends itself to all student loan debt is bad. That's what people hear. And thus, if all student loan debt is bad, does that mean I shouldn't borrow anything? And if I can't borrow, then I can't afford it. And should I not go into higher education? So like these sort of national agitations could be feeding into people's framing. But when you do bring it, even within a survey, to something more local, people are able to consume that information better, because they think about all the things that their local schools are contributing to their community. So that's that. From your comms perspective, Kelly, that is just, I think, very useful for anyone who's watching. And what do we do with the data, given everything that is going on more nationally, that kind of captures people's attention and takes them away from the local aspects that they care about. So we have time for just a couple more questions, and just a reminder to the audience, please submit questions, and I'll try to get to them, but I'm going to ask one more of my questions, then turn it over to the audience. So the Department of Education just had a gainful employment regulation that they just finalized. It establishes a minimum and common sense floor. Basically, a program's graduates must earn more than they would have with only their high school degree, and earn enough to pay down their student loan debt. We're not going to dig into all of the details because it's a very complicated regulation, but that's the gist. But our own varying degrees polling, as Olivia showed, has found wide partisan support for accountability in higher education. What can policymakers learn from how Americans view accountability? I think we're one of the only surveys that really asks every year how Americans feel about accountability. How can we translate this for the value conversation and use it in policy discussions?
I'm going to go first on that one, David.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm so glad you asked that question. I'm gonna I'm dying to use those questions in some other research that we've done. I think that I'll talk. We also did, with support from Arnold Ventures, we did a survey fairly recently of people who had attended for-profit colleges. So that's which there's certainly variation in the for-profit sector, but like there's certainly reasons to be concerned about the outcomes that for-profits have relative to their cost. And I feel like what we saw there, this is specifically among people who had attended for-profits, was actually kind of some concern about, I think because so many people had experienced closures and had experienced their, paying a lot of money for degrees that then weren't valuable anyway, like some some concern about, withholding loan dollars, or withholding money, and like there was concern about anything that could basically lead to the school being shut down because people were sort of just like their degrees already didn't feel like they were worth it. I do think one interesting thing again that came up in that research on people who had attended for-profits was a real belief in the meaning of accreditation. And again, I think in, the higher ed field, we sort of have an understanding of what accreditation means and the limitations of it. But, we often would hear people say like, oh, well, I went to the school and it was accredited, so I thought it was going to be fine, so I think again it's this like these terms that may mean one thing in a policy sector may kind of signal to people things that they don't necessarily mean. So I think that I feel like there's specific to the gainful employment rule, again I think there's kind of room to make sure that people kind of understand how their institution is doing, kind of how institutions overall are doing. And I think there's kind of like, like ways to sort of help people make choices that are going to work for them, in terms of choosing between schools. But I also think, ultimately it should be like, let's make sure that every school, like ideally at any school that someone attends, should be should be high quality, and that people shouldn't let's hope that these rules sort of help lift all boats and are not just about sort of punishing schools, but kind of making sure that like students have many good choices and not many bad choices.
I think in the many good choices spirit, a part of the regulations that were recently finalized by the department certainly included the gainful employment provisions. But there was another part of the rule that I think is exactly to this notion of helping people, families, students, policymakers with good, clear, consistent information about what is happening with the post-secondary experience. And the gainful employment regulations also included a financial value transparency framework that do just this. We have had different elements of post-secondary access and outcomes information available, but what's in this framework is really a win for students and families and decision makers. For the first time, we are going to have metrics around program costs, likely earnings after graduation, debt to earnings ratios, and an earnings premium measure, which is intended to evaluate whether a graduate is likely to have higher earnings than a typical high school graduate. And all of this information is going to be included in a to-be-built website that the department is putting together. But that is information that is not yet available and put together in a manner that individuals are able to compare and contrast between different options. And I think that when it comes to decision making and public accountability, having that transparency and having that value framework out there so that these types of metrics can inform choice is critically important. I alluded to at the top some work that the Post-Secondary Value Commission did, and I would be remiss if I didn't come back to mentioning that, and our comments to the department as they were putting this framework together were inspired by what we call a minimum economic return framework, where we sought to enumerate from T0 to T5 what a minimum economic return should be for a student. And it very much is their ability to earn as much as a high school graduate and recoup their cost of investment within 10 years. And T5 is wealth parity, meaning that there should be no difference between the level of wealth that a white graduate student receives, male, female, other person, and a Black, Latino, any type of student, that there should be parity across the board, across all race and ethnicity groups. So we at IHEP are thrilled with this framework and think this is a big step forward with respect to public accountability and transparency and understanding of post-secondary outcomes.
Yeah, I agree that the financial value transparency framework should be uplifted, I think both for students, but also it will be informative for institutions who don't have this information. Like, I think people just think that institutions just know this, but it actually takes a lot to know this information, and the framework actually needs to be built. And I think it's important for institutions to understand which of their programs are doing well by students, to David's point, are quality programs, and which perhaps need to be changed. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but one question did come in that is sort of like a under the hood type question that is for David and myself. But when our organizations do these surveys, how do we deal with calling college, and higher education, post-secondary, like all the jargon? What do we do to alleviate what people think by these words?
The question come through in the chat, and it's a really good one, and it's something we struggled with in this. There are some questions that we asked in our survey where we were specifically asking about community colleges versus I think we used a term like your state's most selective flagship, and then sort of like the regional colleges. Like, we kind of came up with some terms for the sort of regional comprehensives. I think when we asked about higher education in general, we kind of came up with this sort of awkward phrase of like colleges, universities, and community colleges. Even though it's a little repetitive, like, we felt like we needed to get that word community college in there for those questions that were about higher ed in general. And when I think about, work that I would like to continue doing on this is like just to really pull apart, those terms and really kind of, ask in more detail about community colleges, because even though we kind of put it in those general questions, I do think people see community colleges differently, and in fact, more often more positively. So it's a great question, and I think there's more work to be done on that.
Yeah, and I will say at New America, for our varying degrees survey, we did a lot of message testing, because on varying degrees, unless we're saying otherwise, we really want people, when they're thinking about higher education, to be thinking about all educational opportunities after high school. And so we have a definition that it's a predominantly online survey. And so we have a definition that appears throughout to remind and center people that we're not just like talking about a bachelor's degree, because people's minds so quickly go there. Also, I will say with a survey research, as you discover, especially on a survey that you do year over year, is that the way in which you ask questions, like 2 years or 5 years down the line, you get so annoyed that you ask the question. And I think David's shaking his head. Like, as somebody who's done survey research, you get very annoyed, and like you'll get the results back and you're just like, why did I ask the question that way? Now I can interpret this like a million different ways. So even the placement of questions, like when it comes up on a survey, can change people's answers. So I think the really big thing to keep in mind with this research and the terminology is to really be mindful at every step of the way and know that things can easily, even though you've had like a million eyeballs on them, that you get the results back and you're like, why did I ask that this way? You can change things. But it is hard work to do because people really do have lots of different interpretations about word choice across the board. And so it's very important that we are very clear with what we mean. And this is often why we use the term education after high school, because we found that that really resonated with people and they understood that you were just talking about everything after high school. But yeah, so I know we're at time. I know a few questions came in at the very end. I'm going to try to figure out what to do with those questions. Maybe we could send a little bit of follow-up, but lots of questions about whether we value trade school or not. I think the short answer that we see in our survey, and David, shake your head if you think I'm right. I think the short answer is that people actually do really value trade schools and alternative pathways. And I think they often don't see that those are actually funded. Like people don't think that you can get funding for those, but most of those you can get student loans, you can get a Pell Grant, like those are all viable pathways. So I'll see if maybe we'll do a little bit of follow-up on those questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to them, but I want to thank my panelists for joining me today. This was a great discussion, and I look forward to connecting with everyone out there, maybe in person sometime. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, David. Thanks, Olivia. Thanks, New America.
Thank you.